Christian, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for coming. This is an extraordinary panel we have today. I don't know if you ever watched the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions, where you have like the Rolling Stones, and then they're up there with Nirvana, and then Jack White jumps on stage, and then Run DMC jumps on stage. Today we have that equivalent as a privacy panel. We just have a bunch of, truly remarkable, amazing panelists. And we are going to have a good interactive discussion, and I'm going to try very hard to keep the discussion moving and just stay out of the way. Let me introduce them very quickly. First, we have Marvin Amori, and this is not going to be in order, so you can raise your hands. Marvin Amori, he's an activist, he's a lawyer, he's a scholar, he's a writer, he's a one-man internet defense team. He advises companies like Google and Dropbox. He currently has articles in Slate, Foreign Affairs, and the Harvard Law Review all at once, which is quite a trifecta. Next, Christian Dawson. You all know Christian, CEO of Servant, one of the founders of the I2 Coalition. I just want to say in response to Christian, I am hoping that everybody in this room is a member of the I2 Coalition. If you're not, you ought to be, because I see what Christian does in Washington every day. He does a tremendous job of representing this industry. As Christian said, this started after PIPA and SOPA, when Christian realized that one of the problems we had, one of the challenges we had, is that the vast majority of members of Congress don't really understand how the internet works. And if you don't understand how something works, it's really difficult to care about it. And he helped set up the I2 Coalition, and their mission is to educate Congress about this industry and how it works, and he's been doing a fantastic job, so please support him in the I2 Coalition. Greg Nojeim, Senior Counsel at the Center for Democracy and Technology, renowned expert on national security, terrorism, and Fourth Amendment protections. Then we have Michelle Richardson. She's the Legislative Counsel with the ACLU. ACLU is a fantastic group. I just renewed my membership. You should too. And she focuses on national security and government transparency issues. She also served as the counsel for the House Judiciary Committee. Amy Stepanovich is the Senior Policy Counsel at Access Now, where in her own words, she works hard to keep the government out of your life. That's a good thing. She also co-chairs the very prestigious Computers, Freedom, and Privacy Conference. Finally, Ron Yakubaidis is an internet pioneer. He founded one of the first 50 ISPs in the United States back in the day. He is a old school internet advocate, and again, just a true pioneer of our industry, and he is now CEO of Data Foundry. So let's go into the discussion. The title of this panel is Snowden 1 year later. I'm going to make a request of the panel. I think Snowden himself is an interesting guy, and you can debate about him and his motivations and who he is and him personally. And a lot of the debate has been focused around him as a person. I think while that's understandable, that has also taken away from the debate about exactly what our government is doing and what the response ought to be. Because Snowden, while important, he is an agent, right? He is an agent of radical transparency. But the real issue is our government and our government's actions. So what I'm going to ask the panel to do over the next hour is, to the best of your ability, don't mention the word Snowden. And focus instead on the actions, because that's what the real issue is all about. So let me start with Amy. Just looking back a year, how did we get here? What have we learned over the last year about the U.S. government's surveillance practices?
Sure. So I remember a few years ago I was litigating Freedom of Information Act requests against the NSA. And the Freedom of Information Act allows you to go to government agencies and request documents. So we were talking about their cybersecurity authority, about their surveillance actions. And all we would get was this huge just wall. We would hit a wall, and the NSA would say no, and then the courts would say no, and you just had no window into the National Security Agency's activities whatsoever. So in the last year, one of the things that we've been able to kind of carve out using these documents that an unnamed person helped disclose is this window into the activities of the National Security Agency, and an idea about what surveillance activities are going on and to what extent those activities are unlawful, to what extent those activities go beyond the bounds of what we would like our government to be doing. So without naming many programs that have been disclosed and that I think a lot of people on the stage have spent a lot of time tracking and trying to figure out how they fit together, I think the big thing that we've learned is just the scope, the size, the extent to which our government is spying not only on people within the United States, but also around the world.
Michelle, Marvin, anything you want to add to that? What specifically is our government doing that we did not know about last year that we should be perhaps concerned about?
I took some notes on this, so I can give a few, and then you can fill in if you'd like. So this morning, I decided to sort of look through what do we know now that we didn't know last year, and I'll just give you a few examples of some of the programs that we know, just so we can ground the discussion a little bit. So what we know is that the U.S. government collects the records of who's calling whom for just about every phone call in the U.S. Let me know if I get any details wrong here. They're engaged in sort of upstream collection directly from telcos. They gather information about a target of the investigation, even if the target isn't in the emails. They determine what a target is with only 51% presumption of, or whether they know if the person's 51% foreign or not. And if you're foreign, they can just spy on you, is the idea. And they presume you're foreign unless they positively identify that you're not under certain circumstances. Despite the lax rules, an NSA audit showed that they violated their own rules and policies over 2,000 times within 1 year, about 2,700 times. They perhaps destroyed evidence that the head of the NSA perhaps misstated the fact to a senator during a hearing, claiming that there's no program under which they collect data on millions of Americans. We believe that the top lawyer for the government misled the Supreme Court about the NSA's activities in an argument before the Supreme Court. They also intercept millions of images and use facial recognition on them. They collected 2 years of cell phone location data on Americans as part of a pilot program. They have a program they call Muscular, where they tap into the lines between data centers at Google and Yahoo, perhaps other companies. They have a bull run program that undermines encryption, including undermining standards at the sort of National Standard Agency, NIST, as well as paying a company $10 million for potentially backdoors in their encryption technologies. And they also, to avoid some rules apparently, share data with the Five Eyes governments, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US, to sort of be able to share information on one another's citizens. And if you want sort of 65 things we've learned in the last year, thanks to Snowden, the Electronic Frontier Foundation has a blog post where you can just sort of read them and kind of weep. So that's what we know, among other things.
Well, and I think the 30,000-foot summary is we've learned definitively now that since 9/11, all these changes in the law have taken away suspicion-based investigations. They no longer go after a suspected bad guy and build a case from him. They collect everything. If it's digital and it's collectible, they get it. They don't believe you have any rights in that information, and it can be used for all different purposes against you. And that's how these programs are flourishing. This promise that somewhere in this data, we're going to find the terrorists or the criminals, and it will make us safer. And ultimately, that has not been the case. A year later, lots of congressional hearings. There are no concrete examples of how domestic spying, especially, has ever caught a terrorist.
I tell you what, I'm sorry, can we just expand on that just a little bit? Because before we delve into the implications of all this, I got to ask, a government's primary responsibility to its citizens is to keep its citizens safe. Our government says that these programs, like them or not, are necessary to stop terrorism and keep us safe. How would you respond to that? Michelle, or why don't we start with Amy and then go to Michelle?
So one of the programs that Marvin had alluded to is where the NSA is undermining encryption standards, and I want to focus on that just for a second, because what they're doing is they're actually making everybody less safe online in order to preserve their own surveillance authorities. So the encryption standards that we all rely on to protect our communications, our bank transactions, our emails, basically anything you do online, have been have been kind of messed with by the NSA behind the scenes in ways that not even the encryption setting body is aware of, and has said that they have no idea what the NSA did or why. in order to make it easier for them to conduct surveillance. So this idea that they are actually trying to make us all safer is undermined by their own programs and their own surveillance operations.
And there have been a number of terrorist attacks in the United States since the Patriot Act passed, or the FISA Amendments Act, like the Boston Marathon, right? All this surveillance, and we didn't catch that before. The shooting at Fort Hood. We find actually, in a number of these instances, the shoe bomber, the Christmas Day underwear bomber, these guys we had tips about, but nobody ran them down because we're so preoccupied with big data. We've got all the guys in a room with a computer pulling down all of our phone records, instead of putting the manpower towards catching suspected terrorists in the way that's proven to work.
I'll tell you one thing, that we've seen reports now from both Forbes and the New York Times about the potentially billions of dollars flowing out of the U.S. economy as a result of the actions of the NSA because of a lack of consumer confidence in the U.S. cloud and a belief that the U.S. cares about privacy. And I posit that it does not make the U.S. safer to have a weaker economy and to have fewer jobs.
You know, one of the
I can.
Wait, sorry, Greg.
One of the things that was, can you hear me? One of the things that was most startling to me,
Yes.
Yeah.
that was most startling to me in the revelations was that companies know when the government is making demands of them, and they have to meet those demands. The law requires that they turn over data in response to those demands. What really struck me from the disclosures was that in addition to this coming through the front door, the NSA was essentially wiretapping the companies themselves. It was going through the back door, intercepting the flow of data between the data centers that companies had and that they had located in order to provide services that were better for their users. And it really struck me that they were using this executive authority to get this data instead of going through the front door and saying, we have suspicion about this person, you must turn over this data.
Okay, I think that's a good summry of what we know.
Can I
yes.
just disagree on one point?
Okay.
Or not really a disagreement, but a clarification. Even if it did make us safer, there's a sort of trade-off, this classic trade-off between liberty and security. Our founders, gave us the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable search and seizure, probably realizing that it would probably make some people less safe. And that's a trade-off in a free society. You could move all the way to sort of a totalitarian police state to have more security, but we've chosen to not go in that direction. So I just want to say that even if there were examples of some terrorists being caught, we'd still want to make sure that the trade-off was worth it.
Okay, I think that's a good summary of what we currently know. Let me switch topics. So given this information, and let me go to Ron, what has been the business impact, the practical business impact on your companies and others in the hosting industry, and why?
Am I on? Okay. Practical impact is 5 years ago, we got tired of talking to people and being looked at as nuts. Of course, we're from Texas, so we're a right-wing nut. And you're an Alex Jones lover, but he's a very interesting man. But nevertheless, we would talk about this, and people would go, you're being surveilled. AT&T's surveilling you. Verizon is surveilling you. And you gave them permission in your terms of service. You might need to be a telecom lawyer to understand the terms, but you give them permission. And of course, as we don't have an open internet, we got a monopoly internet, you have no choice. But what we did, recognizing the reality, what are we going to do about it? We put the business into Switzerland. Because you're not going to buy from us, good Europeans, because they understand it. We Americans may be dodos and believe our government, hi, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, and we're going to regulate the internet and give you transparency and all this yammer. You just need, so we just took, if we were going to sell encryption to people, we put it in Switzerland. Now we're in 170 countries. The world wants it. Mr. Snowden has woken everybody up that you can run on the internet, you just can't hide. And if they want you, they're going to get you. Osama bin Laden. So they're surveilling all of us all the time. What are you going to do about it? And we put it in Switzerland. And now they're going to have to talk to a Swiss judge. Not me, talk to the judge.
All right, and Christian, let me go back to you again. Same question on a specific terms. How are hosting companies being impacted by this? What's happening?
I can tell you a little bit about my company, and the numbers are a little bit staggering. Our company's been around for 19 years, and historically, we have seen more business come from outside of the United States than in. On the level of about 60% international business and 40% US-based businesses. In the past year, 70% of our business has been US-based business. So you're talking about a dramatic shift from 60% of our business usually being international to 30. I strongly believe that is in great, that can be directly attributed to what's going on with the NSA revelations. And frankly, how good the rest of the world is at marketing around those revelations.
Just to get a sense of the room, how many of you represent companies that host data or are cloud providers? Put your hands up. Okay, keep your hands up. Your folk, now, how many with your hand up? If your business has lost a customer or a specific opportunity as a result of government surveillance practices? Okay, that's a good number. To Greg and Christian, are customers demanding? What do customers want? Do they want better protection? Do they want reassurances? Are they just pulling their data off and putting it someplace else?
We're really lucky if a customer tells us what they think. You know, the customer can move their business in 2 clicks of a mouse, and so we have really anecdotal evidence about a lot of this stuff. But when the big numbers like that, like going from 60% to 30% international business come out, we feel like yes, they really are demanding more privacy, more transparency of how their data is being managed, and we're trying to step up to the plate and give that to them.
Okay, let's talk now about what's going on in D.C., legislative responses, legal responses. So let's start with Michelle. Congress is now actively considering legislation to restrain the NSA's power, most prominently the USA Freedom Act and other measures like the FISA Amendments Act. Can you give us, in layman's terms, an overview of what these would do, and would they solve the problem?
Sure. So this bill was introduced last fall, and it's now passed the House with bipartisan support, lots of co-sponsors. It started in a much broader form, right, to address a lot of the different revelations, but it's been whittled down, and here's what's left. The phone program will continue in a much smaller form. All of the laws in the foreign intelligence statutes that allow the government to request records and digital information without a warrant, right, this is not the content, but all of the data flow and the stored records, have to be based on selection terms. Now, this is not narrowly defined, but the idea was you could no longer go to a company and say, give us literally everything. Every day, daily download to the NSA. We're going to come to you with some sort of request. And this is getting towards what all of the advocacy groups wanted. We wanted them to focus on specific people. Maybe you go out a hop, right, and see who their associates are, but no more of this grab everything. It does leave some things to be desired. We would want to really specifically say, what's a selection term? This is like a name, an account number, a facility, something much more specific, I think one of the things that's upset me most with the revelations is that they've misled the courts. The courts are authorizing things that Congress and the public never envisioned, as much as even the ACLU, right, got worked up about it. So now we need to be so incredibly specific about what we mean. There's no warrant, perpetual secrecy, compulsory process. It needs to be targeted. So it's now on to the Senate. It will be in the Intelligence and Judiciary Committees, and we're asking them to be much more specific. Go back to that idea that you're starting investigations with a seed, and you're going to go out from there, but there's no more bulk grabbing of all of this data.
One of the important things about the legislation is that it doesn't address your problem, Christian. Your problem is that you can't get clients from abroad because they're worried about the security of the communications that they have. this legislation is not about that. It really only addresses the domestic use of these authorities. So, for example, the program that allows the government to target a person abroad because they are a person abroad, that's it. That's the standard. It's not affected by this legislation. So it's not going to be helpful to companies that want to give assurances to people who are abroad.
Okay, Amy and Marvin, again, okay, let me just rephrase the question. Just, is the USA Freedom Act, as it currently stands, the answer here? And if not, what needs to be done? Amy.
Sure. I think USA Freedom Act, as it stands right now, coming out of the House, needs to be strengthened. It doesn't allow, I think, some of the terms we use in DC, it doesn't allow bulk collection necessarily. You can't collect everything, but it allows bulky collection, as in you might be able to put in 305 and get all of Miami, which is greatly concerning, and I think that needs to be narrowed down. And then I wanted to touch base. There actually is another piece moving through Congress that's not USA Freedom that I do want to highlight just because it might be of interest to people in this room. I had started talking about the cryptography standards and encryption. They're actually, when that revelation came out, NIST, which I promise is the only acronym I'll use, it's the standard-setting body within the United States on encryption, said that they didn't know and they couldn't have known because legislatively, by law, they have to consult with the NSA on encryption standards. So they have to get feedback. There's now a proposal that has passed out of House committee that hopefully will be on its way to the House floor, saying that NIST no longer has to consult with the NSA. They strike that requirement from the law, which is a huge step forward and means that the NSA in small part will be taken out of encryption standards, and I think we're going to see a lot more movement on that front. Access has pushed for greater use of encryption by companies. We actually have Golden Frog as one of our supporters saying that more information needs to be protected.
Ron.
Yes. Following up on Amy's point, the encryption standards are already compromised. As soon as you're talking about it, they're going to, the surveillance state is going to, put their work and break it. What the one thing that we do, and I encourage, we spoke at Linux Fest last week, and it was a response from one of the geeks in the audience. It was a pretty high-dense geek environment, but, well, what about let's all get together and agree on some standards and open source it? And my feeling was that's just serving it up on a platter. I said, more y'all need to start companies or create new encryptions among yourselves and between your servers and da-da-da-da-da. So let's get creative. We created a new one. We call it Chameleon. And it's frustrating a lot of the great firewalls and getting people out of a surveilled state to the open world of free expression. And I was just encouraging the geeks there to get busy. Let's use our creativity rather than, I'm not an inside the Beltway person. We're out here, not too far from the Mexican border in Texas. So some of us speak Spanish, but we're just busy. Now, they're going to have a standard and pass legislation like this. And then but in Texas, we did. So last legislative session, we only let them meet every other year. We passed requirements. You got to have a search warrant for email. We'd been working for 6 years in Washington, so this Freedom Act is the ECPA. But in Texas, of all things, to a lot of people, there's a little bit more liberty-loving state, and requires a search warrant for email and your web content. So we made it for not just email, but content. We suggest y'all go back to your state legislatures and do the same thing. Florida's looked at it, South Carolina. Andy McFarland ran that for us. But it's y'all go back. Inside the federal, these folks will represent you, join their organization. They do a tremendous amount of good work. But still, it's all open. You just got to go back and hack for liberty in your own damn town, your own state. And it's that diversity, that where they just can't control it so easily. And, they're just, and we were at Linux Fest, and folks were kind of thinking, how could we do that? I said, well, let's rent some hosted machines, just set up chat channels, and just have them talk, use all the key words that they're going to surveil on, and just feed them bullcorn. Let them store a bunch of bullcorn. Let them send their investigators looking at these terrorists or whatever it is, and just send them spinning around. So if they're going to have the surveillance state, it's like in the old days when I learned to program computers. You had punch cards, and they'd say on them, don't fold, spindle, or mutilate. Well, a lot of people would fold the corners so the program wouldn't run, hack it up. So I'm saying we're just as citizens, as freeborn people, have just got to learn to disrupt. They're going to surveil us. I have zero confidence that we're going to get any transparency out of the federal surveillance state. No matter what they say, they're going to nod and go ahead and do whatever they want. So it's really, what are we going to do to hack for ourselves for liberty and freedom, and join other people that are concerned about it around the world? But it's on an individual basis. I'm not very confident anymore about we're going to set some policy and there's going to be transparency. It's a nice effort, and I agree with it, but you got to work on that front. But I think individually, you got to arm up, encrypt, as Snowden says. Now you're not a paranoid freak. Snowden says, it's encryption. You got to encrypt up.
I do agree that our customers are demanding encryption to the point where I really feel as though, and you mentioned the surveillance state, what we're seeing is the next Cold War is really going to be the encryption economy versus the surveillance state. And we are part of that encryption economy, giving our customers what they need, and honestly, making it more difficult and more expensive for the NSA to continue doing what they're doing, while at the same time being practical and sensible actors when we engage law enforcement when they come to us for warranted content. We want to make sure that they have the tools that they need through proper warrants to get what they need to solve their problems. But
let me just pick up on that for a second.
Yeah.
So far we've been talking about the NSA disclosures, and they focus on the NSA's capabilities to obtain information covertly. But thinking of the people in this audience, let's suppose, as you were talking about, you're a cloud provider, and the government requests your data. Do you have to comply, and is there any legal recourse?
You do.
if the request, it depends on what form.
If it's a lawful request, you have
Yes.
to comply.
Lawful request.
If it's not a lawful request,
You don't comply.
can and should push back. And that's why a lot of firms have a lot of lawyers can and do push back. One thing that
Can I ask a question? The people who had their hands up that are with companies that host data, could you raise your hands again? How many of you have a lawyer on staff? Keep your hands up if you do. So
how many would like one?
So about 90% of the hands went down. And so what should they do if they're faced with a situation? Should they call EFF? What call the ACLU? What should they do?
People call EFF, they call
The
ACLU.
Electronic Frontier Foundation.
And there are, as you know, there are outside
They
counsel.
might not know. I mean, tell them who to call.
There are outside counsel, and you probably want somebody who's local, who will know the law, because they have a lot of clients that do compliance, that need compliance help. So it's good to have somebody who you can call when those questions come up. One big question, and I want to allude to what Ron was saying, was what do you do when you get a demand for content that is in the form of a subpoena? That's one of the big problems right now. And the reality is that there's a Sixth Circuit court decision that says law enforcement needs to have a warrant for content. And the large providers pretty much across the country are requiring warrants for content. So if you're not doing that, you should know that you're something of an outlier, particularly with respect to the large companies.
Yes.
I'd just like to follow up on the outside counsel. I'm a ringer. I used to be a trial lawyer until I decided to start an internet company in '94. But I was also practiced criminal trial law. So I'm a little practiced in saying no to law enforcement. And that's really the most important word is no, you got to go back and get this right. Dot your I's, cross your T's. In the previous panel, you didn't get to see. I was visiting. It was downstairs, upstairs. I'm not sure, but you might, rather than get your usually exorbitant hourly rate civil lawyer, I would talk to your criminal bar, because the criminal bar, they know how to say no to law enforcement because they're constantly doing that. They're much braver bunch of folks than, well, let's see how complicated we can make this, because that runs up the billable hours, and they'll probably give you free advice for sending them some DWI cases, which everybody in the room here is under threat. So consider your local criminal law. Make a friend of your DWI lawyer. He knows how to make sure you only say, keep your mouth shut, and only say stuff that you're compelled to say, you're required to say.
That's good advice.
Can I give two
yes.
more
Sure.
just sort of non-policy, non-legal, to some extent, things that people have done? So in the last year, after the revelations, a few companies have done sort of two things that are non-policy. One, there's been a rise in transparency reports. And so a lot of the bigger companies and some of the smaller companies now issue a report every year detailing the number of warrants, subpoenas, national security letters, all that, to the extent they can, in a report. And one of my, two reports that were fairly good recently from smaller companies, although pretty big. The Dropbox report was very good and very sort of had a lot of transparency in it. I thought the automatic WordPress.com report was very good. And Dropbox also had sort of a set of principles that they set out for their users, including sort of posing blanket requests, trying to treat all users, foreign and American, the same. So transparency reports are something companies have done. Doesn't require going to DC, doesn't even require having consulting with a lawyer a little bit, but it gives your clients an understanding as to how many requests you might be getting, especially when the Europeans assume that you're just handing stuff over to the NSA on a day-by-day basis. And so that's one thing. The second thing is, and this just happened a week ago, something interesting. There was a day of action called Reset the Net. So if you go to resetthenet.org, you'd see all the companies that were involved. And sort of on the same day, and I think it was the 1-year anniversary or around there of the revelations, a whole bunch of companies announced new encryption and security tools for their users. So Google was part of it, Twitter, Dropbox, Mozilla, a whole slate of companies. I think Mozilla. And what they did is I think Google announced default encryption in some of their email. And so if you have sort of new security tools you want to sort of embed and use, if you sort of make it clear to your users why you're doing it, and that it's sort of part of fighting the surveillance state or making users more secure, those are two things you can do that are sort of non-legal that people are doing to sort of respond to the revelations: transparency reports and added encryption.
And one plug for transparency reports is that the Internet Infrastructure Coalition, the I2 Coalition, we're collaborating with the Online Technology Institute, OTI, and the Berkman Center. They're doing the heavy lifting. We're consulting with them. I'm trying to create templates for transparency reports for companies like ours. So if that's something that you're interested in finding out more about, come to the I2 Coalition, please.
Okay, let's switch back to policy again. If there's one thing this industry has learned over the last couple of years, it's that engagement with government, if done smartly and strategically, it works. It worked with PIPA, it worked with SOPA, it's worked with other issues, and that government can be made to do things and not do things. So let me just address the panel. I'm just going to go down the line on this one. Assuming there are people in this audience who are convinced that government surveillance practices are damaging their business and their ability to compete internationally, and they want to engage and make the government adjust its surveillance practices so they're not damaging, how do they engage? What do they do? Christian.
I have been so convinced over the past couple of years that we have a tremendous amount of strength if we come together with a singular voice. That's why I helped build the Internet Infrastructure Coalition and why I ask everybody in this room to become a member. Groups like CEA are also fantastic in helping us drive forward our goals. Really, join business groups, use your business expertise in a collective way, and help us achieve this stuff together.
Marvin. So being in DC, DC is a totally different world from most of the rest of the country. It's a place where like every other person is a lawyer, and they assume every company, like the second hire, is a lawyer who's complying with rules. And they only hear from really big companies that have lobbyists on hand and entire lobbying firms at their beck and call. Like the way that government officials get information is from really huge companies, like legacy companies, and from the intelligence agencies. Two things that you guys can do to help. And one, they never hear your stories. They don't know anything about, from what I can understand, they don't know much about smaller business. And to the extent that I2C and others can sort of tell those stories, like, here's what it's like to have a small business. Here are the things that we face. This is something CEA did very effectively in a lot of different campaigns where they flew in CEOs of startups and smaller companies, just like understanding what you guys do and that it's so different from the bigger companies they hear from every day, and everyone from the oil companies to the telcos. So one, simply telling your stories, and it's probably most effective to do through an association. And the other thing is, getting your users engaged. It's something that's sort of delicate and sort of you don't want to do every day, but even just sort of informing your users, posting on your blog, letting them know what you're doing, because your users probably love you. And if your users ever pick up the phone and call their member of Congress, those things actually have an impact. Like actual stories and real life impact of laws, I think actually has more of an impact than you'd expect.
Greg.
I think engaging with your local elected officials, as Ron was saying, and with your federal officials is really important. We've been working for 3 years now to try to get this warrant for content rule established nationwide. And every now and then we get a call from Data Foundry saying, hey, we just delivered another co-sponsor for your effort. And we have almost half of the House of Representatives co-sponsoring this bill. But you know what?
More.
Texas went ahead and did it. They went ahead and did warrant for content because people in Texas and a lot of the supporters were companies who would be affected by it went to their local legislators and said, we want this, and here's why. And I think that can be very, very effective.
Okay, Michelle.
Yep, I'll just echo that. Right now, the game is in the United States Senate. Many of you are probably from California, and probably the number one decider over in the Senate is Senator Dianne Feinstein, and she needs to hear from you. Our pleas about privacy have not gotten through to her. She may be more open to hearing about the business impact this is having, and we would love for you to reach out to her.
Amy.
Stay very well informed. There are groups that are trying to let you know when action is needed. I would pay attention to those groups. I would start, if you're going to collect information about people, I would discuss in advance what you're going to do to protect that information. That's so incredibly important. Making sure that the government is not going to tap into your backbone and get information off of your servers or about your customers. Because if you're not having those conversations early, it might be too late, and you're not going to want to be the company that's in the next story about how the government is getting unauthorized access to your equipment.
Okay, Ron.
My understanding is there are now 216 sponsors to the bill when we last left. So it needs 218. So just call your local congressman and senator and ask them, have they sponsored this? And there's a lot of people of goodwill that are there who, if they knew, it wasn't on their priority list for legislation. But it really just, and they're, Lord, really, this. So we're talking about extending a search warrant to their email and your web browsing of you and your staff. That makes a lot of sense. So they need minimum 2 more sponsors, and I'm not up on the legislative parliamentary of it, but that's what gets them over the hump to where it's going to go the next step, and it needs that step. So everybody here, if they called, it'll get it over the top. Sure. I'll say that.
And then Christian, and then we're going to do questions and answers. So please start formulating questions.
So one more thing. We started this by talking about what we have learned in the past year, and I think honestly the scariest thing that we've learned in the past year is that there has not been a tremendous amount of outrage from the American public over these issues. There are not pitchfork-wielding mobs of citizens at the gates of the NSA or in front of Congress demanding change. These are things that we think are extremely important to the future of America, the future of the economy, and the future of the world. And the one thing that I ask you guys is to not get complacent and to do what you can to help drive forward these very important issues.
And if I could add that, there is no more powerful lobbyist to your member of Congress than you as a local job creator. Members of Congress, Republicans, Democrats, they disagree on a lot of things, right? But the one thing they agree on is they all want to come back, and that requires being reelected. And as a job creator, you are critically important. Are the NSA practices, are they necessary to combat terrorism? You can have a debate on that. Is the person who this panel is named after, is he a hero or not a hero? You can have a wonderful debate on that. But when you go in and you say to your member of Congress, because of the government's practices, your constituent, I am losing jobs, I'm unable to hire, I am losing jobs in my company, that is tremendously effective because every debate, every discussion in Congress right now, every issue, it comes down to jobs. And that is far and away the most effective way you can frame this debate or any debate. So with that, let me go to the audience for questions. We maybe have a microphone or else you can speak very loudly. Yes? And could you just say who you are and who you're with?
Exactly.
There's a microphone.
Here, a microphone is on its way.
Oh, here we go. Appreciate it. Comment. Is this on? You guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, a comment was made earlier about Fourth Amendment protections. And I just kind of posed the question, especially since we have attorneys on the panel, that is not the purpose of the Fourth Amendment to protect against search and seizure, a search being a quest for evidence, and the NSA not being a law enforcement agency, not looking for evidence, and not using it to prosecute Americans. So I just kind of pose that as a question.
Who wants to take that?
Yeah.
Yes.
So there's actually two legal regimes. One is the criminal regime, and the other is the intelligence regime. And on the intelligence side, on the criminal side, to get content, you prove probable cause that a crime is being or will be committed. On the intelligence side, you prove probable cause that the person you want to surveil is an agent of a foreign power, like a terrorist organization, or that they're a spy. So there's different standards, and that's for surveillance in the United States. For surveillance outside, the Constitution doesn't extend outside. The rights don't extend outside. So the law permits the government to surveil a person outside because they're a person outside who is not American.
So with that said, my argument becomes...
Yeah, let me respond then. Let me respond. My point was that our founders realized the trade-off between security and liberty. And so to the extent that historically there was a division between sort of surveilling Americans and surveilling folks outside. A lot of these programs involve surveillance of Americans. And so what we have to do is we have to think through, is it worth the trade-off in security and liberty to have the kind of surveillance we're having over Americans? And we can get into the legalities of whether or not the Fourth Amendment extends to American companies housing foreign data or not, right? There are lots of different arguments you can make, but my point was, even if we caught one terrorist as a result of surveilling all Americans, we'd have to ask, is it worth it?
Yeah, understood.
But
sure.
I think there's a misunderstanding there about the Fourth Amendment. It applies to the entire government, not just law enforcement. It may flesh out different when they do searches and seizures for different purposes, and they've got all these different tests, depending on what type of information it is. I think long term, we want to move towards a Fourth Amendment where you need a warrant to collect anything, whether it's a record or it's a content. That has come together in a digital world that just does not make sense to separate anymore. And that's where we want to be.
How do we get there?
Yes.
Ron, you're about us again. All of this is just really trenchant. There's another little thing that's going on, and part of what's has been hanging up the new Electronic Privacy Act, the American Freedom Act, has been the SEC wanting to have their back door an exception and flaunted around terms like an administrative search warrant with a lower standard than probable cause. The bureaucracy protecting itself. You notice there's been no perp walks on Wall Street since the great financial crisis. So the SEC is obviously doing its job. but they want to not surveil miscreants, they want to surveil us. So, and they're using kind of trick language, a search warrant, an administrative search warrant, at a lower standard than the probable cause standard that Greg enunciated for the criminal warrant. So it's kind of gets mumbo jumbo, but the bottom line is you got to learn to say no and make them prove to you their authority and to get all this stuff and make them dot their I's, cross their T's. So you don't have to be a lawyer to say no. They've got the burden. You don't have the burden. The government has the burden to convince you. And hey, they're not going to haul you down to jail, y'all. They're going to go on to the next one that's dumb enough to agree with them. So stand up. Just your own private, drink a cup of coffee and say no. It's not real hard.
All right,
you don't need a lawyer.
We have time for maybe one more question. Do I see anybody? Okay, let me ask one. Generally, our strategy is to avoid regulation. We don't like regulation. On the other hand, regulations might be able to bring some clarity to our obligations as hosting and cloud providers in response to government data requests. Should we be requesting additional help in the form of regulation from Congress or regulators? Greg.
I think, look, one thing that I think lifts all boats is clarity. We have an unclear statutory regime that everybody's laboring under. That's not good for privacy because people don't know when their data is going to be given away to the government. It's not good for law enforcement. They don't know what process to use. And it's not good for companies who are caught in the middle and have to kind of hire lawyers to deal with all these requests. The Email Privacy Act that Ron's talking about would add a degree of clarity and require this warrant for content. The USA Freedom Act, I think, deals with or is intended to deal with a serious problem that would add some clarity, but frankly, it's gotten so weak that we can't tell you to go out and just tell people to support it. It needs serious strengthening.
As to Greg's point, I mean, we have a Section 215 authority under the Patriot Act that says that you can only get business records that are relevant to an authorized investigation. And as clear as that language is, you already have a court saying that all records within the United States could be relevant to an authorized investigation. So we're looking at additional regulations to further clarify the language that we thought was clear. So it is a really huge problem where people who have spent their entire careers studying this language have no idea how things are being interpreted and how they're being rewritten.
Okay, this has been a fantastic panel. Thank you very much to our panelists. Support these companies, support these groups. Have a wonderful time at HostingCon. And mandatory plug, please come visit our little show every January in Las Vegas called the International CES. You're all invited. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
I wish we could.
Yeah, great job. Great job.